The elders of a family are often some of the most important people. Often their knowledge and wisdom imparted to the younger generations sets the stage for the future of a home, a village, a civilization. Whether that's for ill or for gain, sometimes they're an example of what not to do. Someone like Joan McNamara. Element Fire. Zodiac Leo, July 31st. Blood type A. Joan is the family matriarch of the McNamara family, the mother of Ewan and Rory, in-law of Fiona, and grandmother of Tam, Mary, and Brodir. Joan is Alden's link to the Bakery Guild. What does that all mean? The growth of towns and cities throughout the Middle Ages saw a steady increase in trade, and bakers began to set up in businesses. Bakers' guilds were introduced to protect the interests of members and regulate controls governing the price and weight of bread. By Tudor times, Britain was enjoying increased prosperity, and bread had become a real status symbol. The nobility ate small, fine white loaves called manchettes. Merchants and tradesmen ate wheaten cobs, while the poor had to be satisfied with bran loaves. The Tudor times began with the dynasty of the House of Tudor in England, which began with the reign of Henry VII. But rolling back time from there, according to the Federation of Bakers, in 1400 Chaucer wrote The Miller's Tale, pointing out the greedy ways of millers and their suspicious standing in society. In 1307, white bread bakers and brown bread bakers, gosh, I cannot say that again, formed separate guilds. In London, the Bread Street Market defended London bread, forcing rural competitors to sell at uncompetitive prices. Sort of the same thing that large corporations like Walmart do to family-owned businesses in the US. But back in 1266, during Joan's life, the Assize of Bread was written. This was a 13th century law in high medieval England which regulated the price, weight, and quality of the bread and beer manufactured and sold in towns, villages, and hamlets. It was the first law in British history to regulate the production and sale of food. At the local level, this resulted in regulatory licensing systems with arbitrary recurring fees, and fines and punishments for lawbreakers called amercement. The term amercement comes from the Anglo-Saxon and literally means being at the mercy of. While it is synonymous with the word fine, it differs from being a fixed amount. Amercements were commonly used as punishment for minor offenses, as an alternative to imprisonment. Bread regulation was the most significant and long-lasting commercial law in medieval England. The first bread assize law dates back to the 13th century, but its origins are even older. This law can be traced back to the proclamations of the reigns of Henry II and John that regulated the purchasing requirements of the royal household. These assizes adjusted the weight of bread according to the price of wheat. The price of bread was always the same, even though the price of grain fluctuated. Instead, when the price of grain increased, the weight of the bread was reduced accordingly. Shrinkflation, everyone. For every increase in the price of wheat, the weight of the loaf fell. The assize of bread and ale set the price of ale and the weight for a farthing loaf of bread. The act reduced competition and purportedly given at the request of the Bakers' Coventry, embracing several ordinances of Henry III's predecessors. The expensive equipment associated with brewing and baking, particularly the oven, created a commercial market for the goods. This resulted in a perceived need for regulations controlling quality and pricing, and checking weights to avoid fraudulent activity by food providers. In rural areas, the statute was enforced by manorial lords who held tri-weekly court sessions. With Alden being in Scotland and so far out in the hills, Joan receives regular correspondence from the larger guilds, which she then passes to Matthias, their resident manorial lord. This reminds me of the way lords in Japan would measure their own wealth in how much rice their fields could produce. So in a way, the bread assizes of London in the 1200s and before were very much the same as the Kokudaka system of the Edo period in the other side of the world. So what was Joan like? According to those who knew her, Joan was very good with money, had a shrewd business sense, and always put financial success above everything. Everything. I had to stop and think about that for a minute after hearing it, and I started asking a few more questions. She was largely a very private person, especially after her husband left. and raised Eowyn and Rory on her own. Around that time, Rory had also met Clyde, so seeing her daughter married to a wealthy benefactor was a big bonus for Joan. It was the key factor in determining whether or not their marriage was worth it. Similarly, with Fiona being married to Eowyn, at the time, after the Norman invasion, marrying into a family with ties to the Norman French was seen as extremely beneficial, and Fiona was the cousin of the Burgess, Matthias. For Joan, this meant that both of her children, as well as her grandchildren, would be well cared for, and even without the help of her husband, they'd go on to make thriving families of their own. But after this, Joan wasn't content to just sit around and lavishly collect her money. She still took an active part in guild dealings directly with English courts, all the way up until her death. But Joan also had a darker side to her that really only her children knew. Joan was an unrepentant narcissist. Narcissism is a symptom of the broader known narcissistic personality disorder that is categorized by personality qualities including thinking very highly of oneself, needing admiration, believing others are inferior, and lacking empathy for others. Narcissism comes from the Greek word narcissos, of which there is a very popular known story, the story of Narcissus. Narcissus was a figure from Greek mythology who was so impossibly handsome that he fell in love with his own image reflected in a pool of water. Even the nymph Echo could not tempt him from his self-absorption. Narcissus was born in Thespiae, in Boeotia, the son of Sisyphus, the personification of the Boeotian river of the same name, and the nymph Liriope. His mother was warned one day by the seer Tiresias that her son would live a long life as long as he never knows himself. As he reached his teen years, the handsome youth never found anyone that could pull his heartstrings. Indeed, he left in his wake a long trail of distressed and heartbroken maidens, and one or two young men fell by the wayside too. Then one day he chanced to see his own reflection in a pool of water, and thus discovered the ultimate in unrequited love and fell in love with himself. Naturally, this one-way relationship went nowhere, and Narcissus, unable to draw himself away from the pool, pined away in despair until he finally died of thirst and starvation. Immortality, at least of a kind, was assured, though, when his corpse, or in some versions the blood from his self-inflicted stab wound, turned into the flowers which therefore after bore his name. And what about Echo, the nymph who tried to love him? She wasted away after being rejected until only her voice remained, heartbroken and alone. This was written as a cautionary tale about vanity and the harm that it can do to those of us outside ourselves, which is exactly what happened, too, with Joan. Eowyn barely talks, especially to his mother, and Rory couldn't wait to be as far from her overbearing control as possible. Now, it's possible that Joan actually suffers from NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. This is also known as pathological narcissism, and is a mental health condition in which a person believes they are better than everyone else. While many people occasionally behave in a narcissistic way, people with NPD have problems that affect their relationships in everyday life. Given that Joan's traits are what eventually drove her children into having little contact with her as possible, and even creates a rift between her and her grandchildren, it's highly likely that she had NPD, and simply put, that no one in Alden or during that time would have known how to treat it. According to the Mayo Clinic, the best possible treatment for NPD is therapy. The disorder needs to be diagnosed by a professional, not a VTuber, and may include supportive care such as monitoring from a therapist, support group, or loved ones. But also a significant effort needs to be made from the person who suffers from NPD if they wish to improve their empathic skills and their relationships. Narcissism can be very complex. Generally speaking, research draws a line between two types of narcissistic behaviors. These are adaptive narcissism and maladaptive narcissism. Adaptive narcissism is aspects like high self-confidence, self-reliance, and the ability to celebrate oneself. These traits can be seen as helpful, even healthy. They might be characteristics that you see in someone with an extroverted personality. But that's why it's also important to consider the second set of narcissistic behaviors. Maladaptive behaviors connect to traits that don't serve you and can negatively impact how you relate to yourself and others. For example, entitlement, aggression, and manipulation. These could be symptoms of a narcissistic personality disorder or NPD. And not all narcissism is outspoken. That only refers to overt narcissism. Overt narcissism is also known by several other names, including grandiose narcissism and agentic narcissism. This type of narcissism is what people mostly associate with narcissistic personality. Someone with overt narcissism might come across as outgoing, arrogant, entitled, overbearing, having exaggerated self-image, needing to be praised and admired, exploitative, competitive, or lacking in empathy. Some research suggests that people with overt narcissism are more likely to feel good about themselves and less likely to experience uncomfortable emotions like sadness, worry, or loneliness. People with overt narcissism may also tend to overestimate their own abilities and intelligence. Also known as vulnerable narcissism and closet narcissism, covert narcissism is the contrast of overt narcissism. While many people think of narcissism as a loud and overbearing trait, people with covert narcissism don't fit this pattern. Also known as vulnerable narcissism and closet narcissism, covert narcissism is the contrast to overt narcissism. Some common traits of someone with covert narcissism include expressions of low self-esteem, higher likelihood of experiencing anxiety, depression, and shame, introversion, insecurity or low self-confidence, defensiveness, avoidance, a tendency to feel or play the victim. While someone with covert narcissism will still be very self-focused, it's likely to conflict with a deep fear of sense of not being enough. A study on personality and covert narcissism published in 2017 found that it was most strongly linked to high neuroticism, a tendency to experience unpleasant emotions, and disagreeableness. Someone with covert narcissism is likely to have a hard time accepting criticism, but unlike a person with overt narcissism, someone with covert narcissism may be more unlikely to internalize or take in the criticism more harshly than it was intended. Research suggests that categories of covert and overt narcissism aren't always mutually exclusive. In other words, someone with overt narcissism might go through a period where they show more signs of covert narcissism, for example. Antagonistic narcissism is a subtype of overt narcissism. With this aspect of narcissism, the focus is on rivalry and competition. Some features of antagonistic narcissism include arrogance, tendency to take advantage of others, a tendency to compete with others, disagreeability, or proneness for arguing. According to research from 2017 about facets of narcissism and forgiveness, those with antagonistic narcissism reported they are less likely to forgive others than people with other types of narcissism. People with antagonistic narcissism may also have lower levels of trust in others, according to a 2019 study. I know a person like that. Yeah, he's a 10, but he's an antagonistic narcissist. Great. Communal narcissism is another type of overt narcissism, and it's usually seen as the opposite of antagonistic narcissism. Someone with communal narcissism values fairness and is likely to see themselves as altruistic. But research published in 2018 suggests there's a gap between these beliefs and the person's behavior. A person with communal narcissism might become easily morally outraged, describe themselves as empathetic and generous, react strongly to things they see as unfair. So, what makes communal narcissism different from genuine concern for the well-being of others? The key difference is that for people with communal narcissism, social power and self-importance are playing major roles. For example, while communal narcissism might cause you to say and believe you have a strong moral code or care for others, you might not realize the way you treat others doesn't match up with your beliefs. This is the type of narcissist Joan usually sits at. But as we've already talked about, sometimes people might go through a range of different narcissistic tendencies if they have NPD. Narcissism can exist at different levels of severity, and malignant narcissism is a more severe form. It can also cause more problems for a person living with it. Malignant narcissism is more closely connected to overt than covert narcissism. Someone with malignant narcissism may have common traits of narcissism like a strong need for praise and to be elevated above others. But in addition, malignant narcissism can show up as vindictiveness, sadism, or getting enjoyment from the pain of others, aggression when interacting with other people, paranoia, or a heightened worry about potential threats. Someone with malignant narcissism may also share some traits of antisocial personality disorder. And this means someone with malignant narcissism could be more likely to experience legal trouble or substance use disorder. In a small study involving people with borderline personality disorder, or BPD, those with malignant narcissism had a harder time reducing anxiety and gaining a better ability to function in day-to-day life. But that's not all. There's one person who remains close to Joan despite all this. And that's her younger friend, Eleanor. Excuse me. Eleanor Campbell. Element nature. Zodiac Capricorn. December 23rd. Blood type O. Eleanor Campbell is the mother of Ashley Campbell, the mother-in-law of Sheila Campbell, and the grandmother of... Colleen, Davina, Freya, Paisley, Kenna, Ingrid, Blair, and Daniel. Good grief, Ash, get off her. Sorry, that was out of line. Okay, so probably one thing that anyone with a clue on how blood types work would notice that I said Eleanor has O-type blood. However, if you'll remember from Ashley's bingo book, Ashley, her son, has AB blood. This might seem strange. See, blood types pass down from parent to child, and that means compatibility is a factor when we're figuring for these. The blood types for our characters is based on their genetics, so you won't often see apparent mistakes like this. And that's because it's no mistake. It's due to a very rare factor that's often only found in East Asian countries, most notably Korea. But Ashley actually has cis AB blood. No, having cis blood doesn't have anything to do with Ashley's gender, and it doesn't mean he's intersex. Contrary to popular belief, cis doesn't just have to do with things like that. It's used a lot in chemistry and other types of genetics. This would also mean that Eleanor's first husband was also cis AB, and that he passed his AB genetics to Ashley. See, in genetics, cis means two things are happening on the same allele. AB blood type is usually the result of getting an A blood type gene from one parent and a B blood type gene from the other parent. But cis AB blood is a result of getting a single allele that gives you both blood types all on its own. Cis AB blood type was studied first in humans in Japan on Shikoku Island and in South Korea, where this rare type is more common. The Chinese coast provinces and Taiwan also, although it has been seen in a few European families from France, Spain, Belgium, Germany, and Poland. In the year 2004, the American Red Cross described a family in Nebraska with a father of type cis AB negative and a mother type O, and their baby of type cis AB. Since then, several cases in the United States have been reported. So we went with Eleanor as a type O parent to bring awareness to this rare but possible blood phenotype, since we've talked about rare blood types before. But what else? What's Eleanor's story? Well, throughout the day, Eleanor manages her own time dressing meats for consumption by the rest of the village. Her granddaughter Ingrid is married to the McLeod family, and the McLeod family are the village butchers. Eleanor is the sort of person who is always willing to help with any task at hand. She wears a lot of hats, is eager to please, and gets a lot more validation from just seeing other people happy. That's not always a good thing, though, because people that do too much can get worn down extremely quickly. It's the polar opposite of narcissism. Enabling. Enabling isn't always a negative term. As a positive, enabling is similar to empowerment. It describes interactions which allow different people to grow healthy relationships. But that's why it can be difficult to spot an enabler with a negative context. This can describe a dysfunctional behavior that, while intended as help, may actually exacerbate the problem, especially if the enabler meets up with a narcissist. A common theme of enabling in this latter sense is that the third party takes responsibility or blame, or they make excuses or accommodations for the person's harmful behavior. And this is what's called codependency, a theory that attempts to explain imbalanced relationships in which one person enables another person's destructive behavior. Enabling may be observed in a relationship between a person with a substance use disorder and their partner, a spouse, or a parent. Enabling behaviors may include making excuses that prevent others from holding their person accountable, or cleaning up their messes that occur in the wake of their impaired judgment. Enabling may prevent psychological growth in the person being enabled, and may contribute to negative symptoms in the enabler. Enabling may be driven by concern for retaliation or fear of consequence to the person with a substance use disorder, such as a job loss, injury, or self-harm. A parent may allow an addicted adult child to live at home without contributing to the household, such as by helping with chores, and be manipulated by the child's excuses, emotional attacks, and threats of self-harm. Enablers are distinct from proxy abusers. Enablers usually allow or cover for their abuser's own bad behaviors, while proxy abusers actually carry out the bad behaviors to the third party on their behalf. Think about it like this. Joan will do something that is overly selfish or concerned with herself. When it's pointed out to Eleanor, she may say something like, "Well, you know Joan means well," or, "Well, Joan is very important to the village after all," but she doesn't enact the things Joan tells her to do. That would be a proxy abuser, literally called flying monkeys in psychology. Emotional abuse is a brainwashing method that over time can turn someone into an enabler. While the abuser often plays the victim, it is quite common for that true victim to believe that they are responsible for the abuse and thus must adapt and adjust to it. Examples of enabling in an abusive context are as follows: making excuses for others' violent rages, cleaning up someone else's mess, hiding an abuser's dysfunctional actions from public view, absorbing the negative consequences of someone else's bad choices, paying off another person's debts, refusing to confront or protect oneself when exposed to physical, emotional, or verbal assault, regurgitating the abuser's facts or the version of reality to a third party without seeking evidence, re-victimizing the abuser's other victims with behaviors such as gaslighting, denial, or scapegoating, triangulation, playing the part of an abuse triangle as either victim or protector, but never seeing themselves as a perpetrator. Keeping secrets for the abuser such as affairs, extramarital children, alcoholism, gambling, and the list goes on. Projecting or passing their own shame, the shame projected onto them by the abuser, or to third parties. Giving up knowledge of their finances to be taken care of by the abuser, often resulting in considerable debt. It can be a perfect storm if these two types of personalities meet, and I can't help but imagine the trouble it caused the village during the Middle Ages, especially without a complex understanding of mental health. In the modern era, and in the future, people like these can get help to deal with their propensity toward abuse, and there's absolutely no shame in getting help if you need it, or if someone you love is suffering from narcissistic tendencies, or if you find them being an enabler. Take care of your health, even mental health. After all, June is Mental Health Awareness Month.
Oh, a capar Kaylee to appear at my door surely means death.
All right, Danny boy, settle and calm.
And well, that's the end of another project, and I have some possibly distressing news. This is actually going to be the last bingo book entry for a while. We're putting it on a hiatus. Don't worry, nothing's wrong, it's just, well, we don't have any more characters to cover right now. I'll be moving forward with other art projects and focusing on the episodes. Remember that Final Fantasy VI thing I mentioned? I've still got a lot of neat ideas, so like, subscribe, and ring my bell to see just what I've got up my sleeve. Art for this week was by Shalak on Fiverr. I'll put a link to their business down in the description so you can commission a great artwork like this from him personally. His realistic pieces are just the best, and it really helps bring our story to life. Art for this channel wouldn't even be possible, however, without the help of our patrons. Monetization on YouTube is not enough to keep us going, so please follow the Patreon link down in the description to help Tales of Atonement keep going long term. We have a lot left to do and a big story to tell, and we simply can't do it without your help. Besides, there's a ton of extras only available on Patreon that won't be available for months on YouTube, if ever. Some of our great patrons include Pammy Poo, Shadow Fox, Arya Gamari, Charles Tam, Jace Moreland, and Lunder Lumen. Thank you all for watching and supporting our story.